This video will introduce the Renaissance time period and William Shakespeare in preparation for reading Romeo and Juliet. Students often wonder, why do we even read Shakespeare? And one of the primary reasons is because Shakespeare is literally everywhere across the world. Why he's read across the world? There's a bunch of different theories. He's read on every continent, every single continent. I can't say for certain if Antarctica is not one of those, but literally every continent with population, they've performed and understand Shakespeare. So it's also important to understand that Shakespeare has also been discussed and reinterpreted in different areas. So what that means is that these areas that you see on the map here, there are individuals who have read Shakespeare, re-understood Shakespeare to apply it to their time period or to their location. So Shakespeare has been seen and been discussed and published and readapted multiple times throughout the world. Obviously not all of the world, but enough so that we could feel comfortable that the themes that Shakespeare discusses, including Romeo and Juliet, is applicable to other locations. So let's learn a little bit about this guy. First of all, I want to point out that he has such a good-looking bald head. I mean, look at how good-looking. Oh, that is beautiful. That is beautiful. And look at how what a bad boy. It's got an earring. Oh my God. So Shakespeare, he's the most performed playwright of all time. As I pointed out in the previous slides, across the world, he is the most performed, okay, by a ton. The only things that we actually know about Shakespeare come from legal and church documents. So there weren't social security numbers, there weren't documentations of what people did on a day-to-day. There was obviously no social media, so we have no idea to what extent this person named William Shakespeare is actually involved in all of the plays. We do know that a human named William Shakespeare was born and that he died, because the church was involved in that, right? Not even like born, but like he was baptized, okay? And we also know that he was married because of the involvement in the church, or what the church has said. Like I said, we know that he was baptized, and so we recognize his baptismal date as his birthday, which is April 23rd, 1564. And interestingly enough, that is literally the exact same day that he died. Not of 1564, but he died many years later, but on the same date. So there was a lot of discussion about like whether or not he actually died on that date, or if the church was like, well, this guy died, we didn't get his actual date, we'll just say it was the same day as his birthday. So we don't know for certain if that was his actual death date, but we know based on church records, that's when he was baptized. We also know, like I said, not a whole lot about William Shakespeare the person, because we don't have, if it didn't happen through the church, or we don't have any legal documents that verify who he was or what he was doing, then we don't know. We do know that there is records of him going to elementary school, or as they refer to it as grammar school, but we don't know he went to anywhere else beyond that. So if you think about it, the most commonly performed playwright of all time didn't have any education beyond 5th grade, or the equivalent of 5th grade. So, I mean, we're so lucky that this gorgeous head went to at least 5th grade, because then he learned all about what to write about. I just can't get over how beautiful his bald head is. But we do also know that he was married to a woman named Anne Hathaway. Not the Anne Hathaway you know or might know from Hollywood today. But there's also some discussion like, oh, look at this guy. He was 18 when he got married, and his wife was 26. But we do know that they got married. We also know that he moved to London from Stratford-upon-Avon, which was a small town, and he moved to London in order to make money for his family. So to be a playwright, to do all that. We do also know that in 1590 he started acting in what was in the company called Lord Chamberlain's Men. So that was the name of the company that went around and performed plays. And we also know, as I said earlier, that his death certificate, certified by the church, again, was April 23rd, 1616. Again, there's reasons to believe that he did not actually die on that day. We have reason to believe that the church just kind of said that that's when he died. We know that it's probably for certain that he died on 1616, but we don't know for certain if that's his actual date of death. Like there's suspicion behind that. So one thing to keep in mind is that Shakespeare wrote during the Renaissance. And I do know that you have discussed a little bit about the Renaissance in Europe at the time. So the Renaissance at the time period that Shakespeare was writing, happening during the 1500s in London. Now you know that the Renaissance happened earlier in places like Italy, but this happened, we were right in the midst of the Renaissance in England. Okay? It's also important to note that Queen Elizabeth I was supported or fostered the Renaissance, and we'll get more into her on the next slide. That is the reason why in England you might not hear it referred to as the Renaissance, and instead you might see it referred to as the Elizabethan era. That's because she was the queen during the time of the main part of the Renaissance, and she helped foster the growth and understanding during the Renaissance. So during the Renaissance in England, and actually in other areas as well, there was a larger emphasis on things like science, things like commerce or business, philosophy, and the arts. That's where you see these pictures on the side here. This is an image directly from Leonardo da Vinci's notebook, where he was drawing the image of the human body. Like up until this point, they really they didn't have a clear idea of the human body and what was inside of it, but through dissection and more of looking at the scientific understanding of the human body, that's where we get these images of the ligaments and tendons and things like that. The arts also were involved in the Renaissance, but this image here is a good depiction of the science that was also happening at the time period. So here you see an actual dissection happening, and you see all of these men learning from the dissection. So this is a dead body. That's not an actual photograph, that is a painting, but it depicts what was going on during the Renaissance. Okay? The other big thing, and this is hugely important to Romeo and Juliet, that the Renaissance was no longer driven by religious understanding. That people previous to the Renaissance, the belief that God, or specifically the Christian God, influenced our decisions. That when we were born, God knew our life, and there's nothing we could do to change what was going to happen to us. During the Renaissance, there was a new understanding of individuality, and also the freedom of choice. So now, with the Renaissance opened this door of, they didn't abandon religion, they didn't abandon the Christian faith, but what they did do is they started to think well, God gave us the ability to choose, so therefore, what happens to us, we do have some control over. God has created opportunities for us to make those decisions. Now, did some people go so far as to then abandon religion, or like in the case of Martin Luther, start a different religion other than what was happening at the time? Absolutely. But that's not what the Renaissance was marked with, which was an abandonment of religion or faith, or the Christian faith. That's not what happened. It was just instead a different emphasis, that God is not controlling everything, and instead we do control our own fate. It's also important to note that, as I said here, right? So they're not necessarily abandoning God, but they are asking different questions of the deity in Christianity. let's go back to Queen Elizabeth, who was the reigning monarch during this time period. She was, not only was she involved in the Renaissance, which is the growth of the arts, growth of business and commerce and philosophy, she was also the monarch during a pretty troubling time in England's past. So, in particular, Spain during her time period tried to invade. Spain and France are always fighting with England, but Spain had the biggest naval. They had the biggest navy, and so like they were gonna get England. But a wind came in, destroyed the whole Spanish navy, and people attributed that to like Queen Elizabeth and her relationship with God. She also oversaw the fights between Catholics and Protestants during this time period as well. So there's a lot of upheaval and turmoil, but Queen Elizabeth was a consistent voice of calming. Many people attributed their prosperity to her leadership. So we know that this was true historically because there are plays written about how amazing she is. There's poetry written about how awesome she was to society, and stories written during her time period that all talk about how awesome she was. This image here is a pretty common image that you would see, that she's got this it's called the Elizabethan collar here, which is just like a big collar that would jut out. Notice how there's gems everywhere on her dress, adorned with crystals and gems. And then a lot of people don't see they question what this little thing is. That thing is actually called an ermine. An ermine, I don't know if you can see really up close. Do you see how it is white and has black spots on it? That is what you would they would skin the ermine and put it as the lining of the cloak for the cloak for like royal capes and stuff. So the ermine is actually an image of royalty. You'll also see that the ermine also has like a little crown around its neck. Again, this image is depicting Queen Elizabeth as royalty. So that's why you see a lot of people are like, why does she have a rat on her shoulder or on her arm? It's not a rat, it's an ermine, in the rat family kind of. But it is because it's an image of monarchy and royalty. Queen Elizabeth helped foster a strong English culture, which is another reason why we potentially read Shakespeare, is because he was writing at a time when England was really flourishing and being successful. And because Queen Elizabeth decided to foster the arts, like she decided to sponsor financially the arts, other wealthy citizens did as well. So it's not like you could be an artist and you'd get a job and pay for it. You needed to find someone who had enough money to pay for you to buy your materials, to create this product, like whether it be a painting or a sculpture or a play. Someone needed to sponsor you. And so this only happened through wealthy citizens. There weren't companies or anything that could do this. So because Queen Elizabeth did this, other wealthy citizens wanted to do it as well. So other wealthy citizens then, what they did is they went through and they supported playwrights. So they would pay someone who wrote a play, they would pay them to write a play, something that they wanted it to be about. They also sponsored poets, artists, authors to write entire books about them or what was happening in England. Musicians, scientists even were sponsored. So it's because Queen Elizabeth said this is important, so I'm going to financially support this. That's why everything else was supported, is because rich people, wealthy people said, oh, look at her. She's doing it. I'm going to do it too. So think of her as like an influencer. What's interesting is then, like as I said earlier, Shakespeare went in 1590 to perform with the Lord Chamberlain's men, which was then changed because it was the Queen's men, because they performed for her. Okay, so Shakespeare was one of those people that benefited financially from the support that rich people and Queen Elizabeth gave to the arts. Important to note is theater. When we talk about theater during Shakespeare's time, it is not like the theater that we would know today. Okay? Like you don't go to a movie theater, and in fact, many people don't even go to the movie theater anymore today, which is sad. But during the Renaissance, the theater was one of the very few places that both upper class and lower class would have access to. So that means that the rich and the poor would be found together at the theater. There's almost no other places for this to happen. So because and Shakespeare wasn't the only playwright. There was many, many, many different types of playwrights, or many different playwrights, people that would put on plays. And so all different types of people would show up, right? They didn't have like television. They didn't have gaming sets. They didn't have any different types of ways to entertain themselves. So really, rather than watching TV or going on TikTok, they had to go to the theater if they wanted some type of entertainment, okay? And so that's why so many different types of people, not just rich and poor, but even people with different interests and different understandings of the world would show up. And so the reasons that people would show up, the rich and the working class, they would show up for different reasons. So the rich what they liked is they liked the storylines and any history of the play. They really liked the thought that went into the story and the crafting of the language. And like Shakespeare's language would not be something that the working class would understand. They oftentimes, like I would say, like we were told, like maybe like 50%, they would understand 50% of the play. The working class, or the uneducated, the people who didn't have the ability to continuously go to school, they showed up because they like the action scenes, like the fighting and stuff, and they like the dirty jokes. And let me tell you, Shakespeare has a ton of dirty jokes. They loved that stuff. So they would go, and it's basically like seeing a Marvel movie for the working class. Okay? The upper class, the rich and the educated, they liked it. They liked plays because it was a little more of like a foreign film and something that they could really learn from. But not everybody was doing that. It's also important to note that the audience members were like really involved. So unlike today, if we go to a theater, if we go to a play, everybody's really quiet. And in fact, you're shushed. That is not what happened here. In fact, people would like openly cry like loudly during sad moments. They would boo if a villain came on stage. They oftentimes they would throw stuff on stage. It was like not good. Because they also didn't have running water, and so people would poop in the corner, and I'm not kidding when I say that. So they'd literally throw poop up on the stage. But they would cheer if something good happened. So this is, if anything, think of it more as like a sporting event today, where people are loud, people are boisterous, people have things to say, they are cheering, they are booing, they are doing all of that. That's what the theater was during Shakespeare's time. The theater that Shakespeare performed in, or the one that we know the most about, is what's called the Globe Theater. And this image is a model of the Globe Theater. You notice that it has an open ceiling to it. They didn't have running electricity. They needed that so that the sunlight would come in. So that tells you that plays weren't even performed at night. They did try to do it at night once. Not once, but a couple times, or if they did, they'd be really careful, because the only way to get light is through fire. And this structure was made with wood and straw and a little bit of mud. It's going to light on fire. And it did. The Globe Theater burnt down a few times. But in the theater, it is 3 stories high. So there was the ground floor. So right down here, there's the ground. Then you can see there is seats there. There's seats there. And there's seats there. So there's 3, and you'll see another picture of the globe to kind of see those 3 different areas. So the actors performed on a raised stage, as you can see right here. Okay, so I don't know why that didn't show up. So right here, that's the raised. That's where the play, or that's where the actors would be. There would be upwards of 3,000 people up watching the play, and so it usually was a packed house. The cheapest seats were, and this would be where the working class would be, the cheapest seats were right next to the stage. So that's where that ground stuff is. So you can't really see it, but like I'm highlighting it green there. That's where you would see the cheapest seats be, down here, because you had to stand literally the whole time. So, and the people that could afford that were called the penny stinkards, because they stunk, because they didn't shower, because showering was not common. The more money that you had, the better seats you could get. So let's take a look at what this might look like. So I was actually in a recreation of the Globe Theatre when my husband and I went to England. Oh my gosh, like 15 years ago. So my husband and I sat right, let's see if this will turn on. We sat right here. And there was a ton of people that were standing all around here, and they would get kicked out if they sat down. Like they literally, because that takes up more space. So there was people, you could pay more money to sit up here. You could pay even more money to sit up here. Nobody was sitting on this stage when I was there, but back in the day, you could get seats right here if you were wealthy enough. And people wanted those seats because if you're there, you got money and everybody can see you. Okay? So here's some other images to give you a heads up. Like, look at how uncomfortable these seats would have been. So I can testify to this. These seats were not comfy. They were wooden planks that you sat on, and you could buy a cushion, but holy buckets, they were not comfortable. Here's what the stage would have, like this image here is what the stage would have looked like if you were standing down below. This gentleman thought I was asking him to take a picture. I was not. I just wanted him to move. He didn't want to move. That's cool. And he didn't speak English because he was out of town. We were both traveling, and so I couldn't get him to move. But yeah, that's my picture. This is also an illegal picture, but because you're not supposed to take pictures while you are in the theater. But this is the play that was starting, and so you can see the actors on stage here, and you can see all of the people that are standing, right? So and again, is this an illegal picture? Because you're not supposed to take a picture. Many people got their cameras and phones taken away because they took a picture. So I'm super stealthy. Super stealthy. One thing that I do want to point out is that, and you saw this in the previous slide, that the theater relied heavily on the imagination of the audience, because they didn't have all of these sound effects. Like they didn't have like special effects. They also had to be very careful when it came to fire. So wasn't a whole lot, like there wasn't a whole lot of costume changes either. They did the best they could with their costuming. As you can see here, like they put a lot of effort into putting costumes in, but there wasn't a lot of costume changes. Instead, the audience either had to use their imagination, or they changed it so that the image, like the costumes would look different. So there's a lot of props. They used sound effects and costumes at times. There weren't even any curtains. So take a look. There weren't any curtains. It was literally out in the open. There wasn't scenery like shrubs or like cutouts of anything on the side. That just wasn't available. They didn't have the money, the time. They didn't have that available to them. The other thing that's interesting, and it's important to note, is that at the time, women weren't allowed to be on stage. They actually thought that women were not capable of doing that, and it was too much hard work, that women were not. They couldn't demonstrate they couldn't tell the story as well. So men took the spot, or boys took the spots of all of the characters. there were there were obviously women parts, but either men or boys would play those parts. And again, this wasn't because anything that like they wasn't supporting anything in particular. What it was they thought women were inferior to men. So they said, well, because women are inferior, men get to play all of the roles. So that's and that's also why the plays that you see, there isn't a whole lot of like activity that would be considered inappropriate. So there's no, unlike movies that you might see today where people are making out or there might be sex scenes, like that's not happening in plays. Because regardless of who is engaging in that, that would be illegal. Like a man and a woman, even if they were on stage, anything that would be considered inappropriate, that was considered lewd, and they would be arrested. But also, if people of the same sex were engaging in any activity, that was immediate death penalty. So this has nothing to do with sexuality. It has to do with saying women can't do this. So not cool. Okay. The other thing to note about Shakespeare is that a lot of the language he used was completely made up. Like he made up the language. So there were words that he didn't have, and so he's like, you know what? I'll just make it up. I wish he made a word that described a sexy bald head, because that's what he has. But anyways, I got distracted. So Shakespeare created many of the words. So some of these things like assassination, he was the first to create that. Flowery, he was the first to use that in writing. And we know that because people studied language for literally thousands of years. So the first time that we hear things like for goodness sake or dead as a doornail, he made those up. So that's another reason why we read Shakespeare, is because his impact on the English language is so profound and so big. Some context about Romeo and Juliet. His play was actually based on a poem from 1562. So this was a poem that he quote unquote borrowed the idea, as he did many of his ideas. He borrowed a lot of them. As you see up here, some historical figures or other stories that he has borrowed from and made his plays famous. Like you could say that he is the first plagiarizer. But it's important to note that this story of Romeo and Juliet was not unknown. It was a poem that was published in Italy and had made its way around. So Shakespeare knew about it, and his audience would have known about it as well. So this is just a brief understanding of Shakespeare, and I hope you learned, and I hope you saw the good-looking man that is William Shakespeare. #LoveThatBaldHead.